Hello everyone, in this presentation I'm going to talk about parts of a sentence. Basically, I'm going to focus on how to carry out sentence analysis. And in order to do that, in order to analyze sentences, it would be better to break down sentences into smaller components, namely phrases. Now, if you consider the example in front of you, this boy will speak very slowly to that girl. It would be a good idea to break down this sentence into smaller components. Now we know that the word this and boy go together, making a phrase. And also that girl, the word that and the word girl go together, making another phrase. And also we know that very slowly go together to make another phrase. And to that girl would go together in order to make a bigger phrase, and speak very slowly form another phrase. And actually will speak very slowly, this could be considered as one phrase too. And all of these phrases together would form a sentence. Well, that brings us to think about sentence structure. Okay? Now, what is structure? Now, structure of a unit, whether a sentence or a phrase, refers to the parts that make up the unit. So, for example, a sentence may have the structure subject, verb, object. Look at the sentence in front of you. David has written a good paper. Now, David is the subject, has written a verb or phrase, this is the verb, and a good paper, this is the object. Also, phrases have structure, and structure of phrases could vary. Nonetheless, consider the example, a good paper. What do we have? We have a determiner, good, a pre-modifier, and a paper. At the bottom line, you need to keep in mind that sentences and phrases have to have structure. And in order to understand the structure of sentences, it would be better to break sentences down into smaller components. Namely, those components are known as phrases. Now, from a previous video, you should remember that there are 5 types of phrases. There is a noun phrase, there is also the verb phrase, an adjective phrase, or an adverb phrase, or prepositional phrases. Now, when I say a noun phrase or a verb phrase, then I'm talking about the form, okay? However, these phrases could perform different functions. But before we get into the functions, so in order to analyze sentences in terms of phrases, we can do this. Now, again, if you have a sentence, then you need to break it down into smaller phrases, and in terms of phrases, each and every sentence has to have a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase, as we have stated in more than one occasion, could be made up of more than one word. It could have a determiner and it could have a noun. The determiner could be a qualifier, or it could be something else. Okay. Now the verb phrase, it could be divided into other components. The verb phrase could be comprised of 2 components, the verb and the noun phrase. Now, again, the noun phrase could be more than one word. In this case, we have an article and a noun. And look at the sentence, many students use the internet. Again, so this was an analysis according to phrases. Okay, according to phrases. So keep that in mind. And as I said, phrases perform various functions in sentences depending on their position in those sentences. Now, again, look at the example. A heavy snowfall has blocked the mountain passes. Now, in order to understand the structure of the sentence, it would be better to break it down into smaller phrases. The possible phrases that we could have: number one, a heavy snowfall has blocked and the mountain passes. Now we end up with the three phrases. Now, again, you need to remember that these phrases also have to have correct structure. We cannot really put words together in a random way in order to make up phrases. So look at, so for example, a heavy snowfall. Heavy snowfall is not acceptable phrase because the structure is not correct. The same applies to blocked has. This is not acceptable structure. The same thing applies to the third one, the passes mountain. This is not an acceptable structure. So basically, sentences have structure, phrases also have structure. We cannot really put words together randomly. This is one. Also, phrases could play different roles in sentences. Phrases could behave differently in sentences depending on their position. And this is what is known as function. Phrases could have different functions. Phrases could have various functions in sentences. In other words, phrases could behave differently depending on their position in sentences. Consider this example again. A heavy snowfall has blocked the mountain passes. A heavy snowfall is a noun phrase, and in this sentence, it functions as a subject. And the mountain passes, this is another noun phrase, however, it functions as an object. Now, if we were to change the position of the same phrases, then if we were to change the position, then the function would change accordingly. Consider this example. They encountered a heavy snowfall. Now again, as a heavy snowfall, this is a noun phrase. And in the previous example, it played the function of a subject. However, in this sentence, it is considered as the object. The same thing for the mountain passes. It's a noun phrase. In the first sentence, it was an object. Here, it is the subject. So ultimately, phrases could perform different functions. Phrases could behave differently depending on their position. Now, this brings us to analyzing sentences in terms of the function of their constituents. Consider this. Now, according to function, sentences have to have subjects and they have to have predicates. Now, the predicate could be made of more than one part. It could be made up of auxiliary, which can be considered as an operator, and also a predication. The predication includes the main verb and the rest of the sentence. Hence, we have the sentence, he, the subject, had the auxiliary, and given the girl an apple, the predication. Now, if you notes could be stated regarding the subject in terms of meaning, of course, the subject can be thought of as what is being discussed or the theme of the sentence. However, the predicate can be considered as what is being said about the subject. Okay, so this is very important in terms of meaning. Also, subject determines concord. In a previous video, we talked about subject-verb agreement. This is exactly the same. When I say subject determines concord, then I'm talking about subject-verb agreement. Also, you need to understand that subject can change its position. Now, why would a subject? Other examples that have to do with analyzing sentences in terms of function. Now look at this one: subject and predicate. Subject would be of, as in example number 1, I have learned all this much later. I is the subject. It is made up of one word. Learned all this much later. This is the predicate, which is in this sentence we don't have an auxiliary, so only the predication. Also, the chef is a young man with a broad experience of the world. The chef, this is a noun, a phrase made up of determiner, a determiner, and a noun, which functions as a subject. And the predicate is a young man with a broad experience of the world. We have the main verb is and the rest of the sentence. Also, the subject, the third example, the fate of the land parallels the fate of the culture. Now, the fate of the land, this is a noun, a phrase made up of 5 words, and the predicate includes parallels the fate of the culture, the main verb, and the rest of the sentence. The most important thing is that you need to keep in mind that the predicate could be of 2 parts: the auxiliary and the main verb plus the rest of the sentence. The operator is the part of the predicate that, among other functions, interchanges with the subject when we form questions. I will show you examples in a minute. And the operator also comes before not or contracted, as in int, in negative sentences. The operator is usually the first auxiliary in the verb or phrase. So look at the examples. Have you seen my pen? Now, have, this is an auxiliary, and it is considered as the operator. Example number 2, I have not replied to her letter. Again, have here is the operator, and it could be contracted with not. I haven't replied to her letter. In subject operator inversion, the usual order is inverted. So again, look at the sentence in front of you. He had given the girl an apple. So the usual order, we have a subject, then the auxiliary, then the operator. But in the case of subject operator inversion, that is when we form interrogative sentences, then the order is inverted. The operator comes before the subject. Okay? The subject operator inversion occurs chiefly in questions. Okay? As in this one. Had he given the girl an apple? And also the subject verb inversion occurs when a negative element is affronted. Look at the examples. Are you staying? Then we inverted the positions of both the subject and the operator. Example number 2, not a word did we hear. Not a word did we hear. In this sentence, we fronted the negative element, that is not. You need also to understand that the operator plays 4 basic roles. The first role that the operator plays is to form questions. Look at the example. You could have been imagining it. Then we can make a question by utilizing the first auxiliary, and hence we have the second example. Could you have been imagining it? Also, the operator plays a very important role in forming negative sentences. Consider the example: Nancy will be staying with us. Nancy will not be staying with us. Again, so we added not after will, which is the operator. The other role that the operator performs has to do with indicating emphasis. Look at the example. In this imperative sentence, you can talk to someone telling them to finish their homework. So that person would reply or would respond as I have finished my homework. In this sentence, the operator is being utilized to indicate emphasis. And the last role for the operator has to do with substituting the predicate, as in, especially in tag questions, are you leaving? You could say yes, I am. Basically, you should have say yes, I am leaving. However, since we have the operator, then we substituted the predicate by only utilizing the operator. This has to do with sentences that contain an auxiliary, and we know that we can utilize the auxiliary or the first auxiliary as the operator. What about sentences that do not have an auxiliary? What do we do? Well, in such sentences, we can utilize something called dummy operator, do. Now, the dummy operator is the verb do. It is used to perform the functions of an operator when an operator is otherwise absent. The three verb forms are do and does for the present tense and did for the past tense. Consider the example: Terry works for a public authority. Now, this is a statement and it does not have an auxiliary. And the question is, what do we do, or how can we form a yes-no question if there is no auxiliary? Well, we can use the dummy operator do. And therefore, we can say, does Terry work for a public authority? And in order to negate the sentence, we can say, Terry doesn't work for a public authority. And to show emphasis, we can say, Terry does work for a public authority and her sister does too. We're left with one minor detail. If we have sentences in which the verb to be is the main verb, then how can we form yes-no questions, or how do we negate them? Well, it's easy. We can utilize the main verb, the verb to be, to form yes-no questions. Look at the example. It was an awful system. I would say, in order to make a yes-no question, was it an awful system? And in order to negate it, I would say it was not an awful system. The other detail that you need to pay attention to, you need to pay attention to sentences that contain the verb have as the main verb. Now, it depends on the variety, which variety you prefer. So look at the example. Nora has just one daughter. Now, has is the main verb. Now, in the British English, you can use has as an operator to form yes-no questions, but in American English, this is not possible because they utilize the dummy operator do in order to negate or the sentence, or in order to form yes-no questions. That's it for this presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know.